by the Department of Political Science. Over the last decade, tonight's speaker has compiled a really enviable record of scholarly achievement and has established a place as being one of the outstanding experts on British politics. He has published several books, many articles, and his work has concentrated on the British Conservative Party, on British Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, and on the British Constitution. There probably is not anybody who teaches British politics that is not familiar with his work. And given the quantity and the quality of it, it is very difficult to point to one particular thing and say, this is the jewel in the crown. But nonetheless, there is one thing I think that is worth some mention in that context. As many of you are aware, in Britain there is no Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. In fact, there is no written Constitution. So to a considerable extent, the British Constitution is what legal and scholarly experts writing about it say that it is. Now, it's not an overstatement to say that our understanding of one of the key relationships in the British Constitution turns upon the work of tonight's speaker. He has clarified this relationship. He has dispelled various myths and misconceptions that were associated with it and has achieved a considerable reputation for that alone, apart from all his other work. Now, this is not just a case of someone tonight who is known to other academics, although that certainly is true. He also is well known to the practitioners, to the practical politicians as well. For example, at the point that he was promoted to the rank of professor, and when one of his recent books was published, there were receptions held for him at the House of Commons, and among those who came by to extend their congratulations on these events were various national politicians. So his reputation extends to them as well. In addition to the various scholarly research work that he has done, he also has been active in professional associations. In Britain, the political scientists belong to the Political Studies Association, and he has served on the executive of the Political Studies Association. There's another group, particularly for those who are interested in Parliament, the Study of Parliament group, and here again, he has played a very active leadership role in that. And then to get to the international dimension, there is in the United States an organization known as the British Politics Group. He currently serves as the president of that. So this is a further indication of the type of reputation he has established. Now, many of you will be aware that earlier this year, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, observed, and I think that's the term we should use because I don't think we can really say celebrated, but Margaret Thatcher observed the 10th anniversary of her rise to power as Prime Minister in Britain. This is a record that obliterates all of the previous records of the 20th century. All the great names in British politics in the 20th century, of these names like Churchill and Lloyd George and Asquith, none of these served as long in office as Prime Minister as Margaret Thatcher has. So she is indeed a phenomenon. And it seemed entirely appropriate that we make this the subject on which we ask our speaker to talk with us tonight. And so it is with a considerable amount of pleasure that I present to you the head of the Department of Politics at the University of Hull in England, Professor Philip Norton.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and one of the reasons I accept invitations like this is in order to listen to introductions like that, which are very glowing, and my only worry is that then having to actually live up to it. My focus this evening, has just been explained, is going to be really 10 years of Thatcherism, because Margaret Thatcher has dominated British political life in the 1980s. She's Britain's first female Prime Minister. As we've heard, she's just celebrated 10 years in office, which makes her Britain's longest continuously serving Prime Minister, in fact, since Lord Liverpool at the beginning of the 19th century. She's also the first Prime Minister since Liverpool's tenure to lead a party to 3 successive election victories. She's the first Prime Minister in British history to generate an ism, Thatcherism. And she's the first peacetime Prime Minister in modern history to adopt unambiguously the leadership role of an innovator. She's also generated one of the most remarkable growth industries in Britain today, and that is the study of her character and her beliefs. More than a score of books and innumerable articles have come off the printing presses since she became leader of the Conservative Party in 1975. She's been the subject of several biographies. Her premiership has been analysed in a wide variety of works. Her philosophy has been variously dissected, criticised and lauded. Her activities are the subject of avid scrutiny nationally, and now that she is the longest serving of Western leaders internationally. She has declared her desire to go on and on and on. She's almost certain to lead the Conservative Party into the next general election. There are even some prepared to envisage her as Prime Minister still at the turn of the century, when she will still be younger than was Ronald Reagan when he left the White House. At the moment, British politics is Margaret Thatcher. Well, given the impact and visibility of Mrs. Thatcher and her eponymous philosophy, it's not surprising that she and her beliefs are widely studied and commented upon. Yet what is remarkable is, despite such extensive coverage, Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism are so little understood. And the purpose of my presentation this evening is really to try to provide a tentative framework for the understanding of both. So let me begin, if I may, by identifying 4 propositions that can be and have been made about Thatcherism. The first proposition that's been put forward is that Thatcherism constitutes a coherent set of beliefs, that distinguish it as an exclusive strand of thought within British conservatism. The second proposition is that coherent set of beliefs, that is Thatcherism, emerged in the wake of Mrs. Thatcher's election as leader of the Conservative Party in 1975 and constituted a response, an inevitable response, to structural decline in the British economy. The third proposition is that Thatcherism generated a clear programme of policies that provided the basis for electoral success in 3 successive elections. And fourthly, of longer term significance, that Mrs. Thatcher has caught a change in national mood, reinforced that mood, and generated popular attitudes and values that will outlive her tenure of Downing Street. In other words, that Thatcherism is bigger than Mrs. Thatcher. Now, all 4 would seem reasonable and plausible propositions. I take issue with every one. Collectively, they impart a degree of historical and philosophical consistency that does not exist. Individually, they are inaccurate or in need of serious qualification. And to demonstrate that, I really need to address myself to 4 questions that are generated by those propositions and my response to them. First, what is Thatcherism? Second, when did it emerge in recognisable form? Third, what success has it had? And fourth, is Thatcherism bigger than Mrs. Thatcher? And my answers will actually generate a 5th question, arguably the most important of all, and that is, what explains the continued success of the Conservative Party in Britain? In other words, the party which Mrs. Thatcher leads. Well, let me, if I may, take those in turn. First of all, what is Thatcherism? Thatcherism has been more commented upon than defined. Of attempts at definition, the 2 most substantial have been by British academics Andrew Gamble and Dennis Kavanagh. Indeed, the title of Gamble's book, The Free Economy and the Strong State, encapsulates the essence, insofar as there is an essence, of Thatcherism. The emphasis is very much upon the liberating effects of market capitalism. The market is seen as necessary for wealth creation. competition and efficient marketing, not government intervention, create wealth. And the competitive forces of the free market are seen as being essentially democratic. They allow the individual consumer the opportunity to register his or her preference with every purchase. What the consumer desires prospers, what the consumer does not like will fail. Government intervention in the affairs of the nation is viewed as harmful and, in essence, illegitimate. Sir Keith, now Lord Joseph, who was Mrs. Thatcher's mentor in the 1970s, observed that there are limits to the good which governments can do to help the economy, but no limits to the harm. And government intervention on this analysis can lead only to inefficiency, monopoly, and a decline in the ability of the nation to compete internationally. Individualism is stifled, the individual constrained, and respects for the institutions of government diminished. The essence of a free society, declared Mrs. Thatcher, is that there are whole areas of life where the state has no business at all, no right to intervene. Well, translated into terms of public policy, what this approach has dictated has been attempts to achieve massive reductions in taxation and public spending, in controlling the money supply, and in adhering to free collective wage bargaining as an alternative to subsidies and pay norms. The consequence of such policies is seen as being to energise individual initiative and so reverse what Mrs. Thatcher sees as the creeping collectivism of post-war years, a collectivism indulged in by both Conservative and Labour governments. So the attempt is being really to roll back the growth of the state and the state in conjunction with outside groups over the period of post-war years. Yet at the same time, there has been the moulding of a strong state, of the strengthening of government at the centre. And this has been seen as necessary for three reasons. First, in order to undo the collectivist forces created by past governments. Collectivist forces are seen as so well entrenched that they can be dislodged only by a government in clear control of the levers of power. So the government has actually had to centralise power in order to achieve a degree of autonomy from groups in British society. Second, it's been seen as necessary to actually help wealth creation, the state holding and policing the ring within which market forces can operate. And third, it's seen as necessary in order to fulfil those tasks which government alone can fulfil, primarily defence of the realm abroad, maintenance of the Queen's peace at home. That is consonant with traditional conservative values, with an emphasis on a strong defence and on maintaining law and order. But two of the three reasons, the first two, do present a seeming paradox, because the attempt to remove government from the economic arena necessitates government intervention in order to achieve its realisation. In other words, the actual circumstances with which market purists are faced necessitates deviation from the principle which they actually seek to implement. But insofar as on the economic side there is an essence of Thatcherism, it is embodied in the free economy and by virtue of circumstance the strong state. But there is more to Thatcherism than that. There is also a very clear moral strain, with an emphasis on family values and on the maintenance of public and educational standards. Mrs. Thatcher has been keen not only to laud and create the economic liberalism of the Victorian era, but also to laud and recreate Victorian morality as well. And the implications of this moral strain I'll return to shortly. So there's an economic side to Thatcherism, there is also a moral side. But there is also more to Thatcherism in terms of its approach to politics than a set of beliefs. It encompasses also the manner in which it seeks to achieve them. Indeed, the most visible form of Thatcherism is its style. That style is an aggressive and combative one. Mrs. Thatcher and her supporters being prepared to proclaim publicly and confidently the values which they espouse, and to take on all those who are prepared to challenge them. No apologies are given, no quarter given. Mrs. Thatcher's disparaging dismissal of some of her colleagues as being wet refers as much to their half-hearted commitment to pursuing their case as much as to the case itself. Mrs. Thatcher has no hesitation at all in using the public arena for the proclamation of a personal credo, and if necessary, for mobilising support for it. There is a very clear populist strain to Thatcherism. So Thatcherism then embodies both an economic strain, a moral strain, and also a style of politics. And that provides a very quick thumbnail sketch of what Thatcherism is. But it is necessary also to establish what it is not. It is not an exclusive strand of thought within British conservatism. Conservatism in Britain really exhibits two principal strains, though each may be further subdivided. But the principal strains are those of Tory and Whig. In the Tory strand of thought, the emphasis is on morals, on order, on maintaining social harmony and harmony between leaders and led, and on the here and now, on what is happening at present. The Whig strand is more forward-looking. There's an emphasis on economics, essentially on the imperatives of capital accumulation, and on achieving future goals. Now, for most of the 20th century, the Conservative Party has been led by leaders drawn from the Tory strand of thought within British conservatism. In post-war years, that has meant Winston Churchill, Sir Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and Sir Alec Douglas-Home. The party changed in 1965 when it chose as leader, the parliamentary party elected as leader, Edward Heath, who ostensibly was seen as being drawn from the Whig strand of thought within the party, and within the Whig strand from the neoliberal element of Whig thought, in which the emphasis on the free market is pronounced, and where a free market is seen as an end in itself. In fact, it emerged that he was drawn from the other element of Whig thought, which has been categorised as a corporate Whig strand of thought, where the free market is merely a means to an end, the end being economic efficiency. And if government withdrawal from economic life fails to achieve that efficiency, then government intervention may be necessary to help create it instead. And that is the approach that Heath took. He was essentially a corporate Whig. He was concerned to create more efficiency. When government withdrawal from the economy did not achieve that, British industry did not respond, he engaged instead in government intervention in economic affairs in 1972 with U-turns on economic policy and on government aid to industry. Now, his successor, Mrs. Thatcher, is quite clearly and justifiably associated with that neoliberal element in Whig thought, that is, the emphasis on the market economy, and the market economy being seen as intrinsically good, and therefore an end in itself. However, to characterise Mrs. Thatcher as being exclusively a neoliberal, divorced completely from the Tory wing of the party, is to misunderstand both British conservatism and Margaret Thatcher. Every Conservative in Britain exhibits values which are not confined to one particular strand of thought. The strands of thought within British conservatism are not only several, but they are overlapping. So one doesn't have two mutually exclusive camps of Whig and Tory. And that, in essence, is why the Conservative Party is not a factional party, but rather, to use Richard Rose's terminology, a party of tendencies. What is really at issue is not whether there's an overlap between the strands of Conservative thought, but rather the extent of that overlap. So, other than exceptionally, one does not have a Conservative who is a pure neoliberal, sharing none of the values associated with other strands of Conservative thought. And it is significant in Britain that the pure neoliberals are to be found not in the Conservative Party, but in various research institutes and think tanks, such as the Adam Smith Institute, which presently support the policies of the Conservative government, but are not part of the Conservative Party. if you like, they stand on the sidelines and cheer, but they are not actually involved in the game itself. Now, as a Conservative, Mrs. Thatcher is not exceptional. She is preponderantly a neoliberal, but by no means exclusively so. Indeed, she may be described rather as a neoliberal by intellectual persuasion, but a combative Tory at heart. She has not been able to rid herself, though she has tried, of her Tory and indeed her Methodist antecedents. She equates reward with effort and skill. That is a very clear moral equation, one which she was brought up on and cannot rid herself of. As I've touched upon already, there is a very clear moral strain to Thatcherism. So within Mrs. Thatcher, there is both the neoliberal but also the Tory, with the emphasis on maintaining standards and values, and an emphasis in particular on maintaining law and order. Whereas within the pure neoliberal strain, there is very much a libertarian element, which is very much lacking in Mrs. Thatcher's thought. Thus, circumstance necessitating a strong state, and Mrs. Thatcher's inbred morality has militated against Thatcherism as a set of beliefs being equated wholly and exclusively with pursuit of a market economy. Nor should one be misled by the style of Thatcherism. The aggressive partisan stance of Mrs. Thatcher actually masks very acute political antennae and a willingness to compromise in the face of insurmountable political odds. Mrs. Thatcher has a remarkable capacity to sense what is acceptable to the nation's electors and to the party's supporters. It is a capacity enjoyed by no other politician in Britain at the moment, indeed, or in recent history. Politicians traditionally tend to look at policies in terms of the here and now, in terms of whether they are popular or not. Mrs. Thatcher can view them from the perspective, a more future-oriented perspective, of whether they will actually prove to be acceptable or not. And that is a remarkable skill, which has not really left her at all over the past 10 years. And it's a skill that really has been demonstrated by no other politician in Britain. And when she recognises that a policy is not likely to prove acceptable, she modifies or abandons it. And indeed, a change in the rules for the leadership for the election of the Conservative Party leader, and a more independent attitude on the part of Conservative members of Parliament since the 1970s, has actually made Mrs. Thatcher far more responsive to her own parliamentary party than any of her recent predecessors as Conservative leader. So in the face of threatened defeat, or in the face of widespread dissension among her own supporters, she, and indeed her ministers, since 1979, have been willing to withdraw bills or modify or abandon policy proposals. So Thatcherism is thus more complex in terms of beliefs and style than is popularly perceived. To a large extent, the rhetoric of Thatcherism masks its reality. So Thatcherism is a fairly complex phenomenon with an economic strain, a moral strain, a particular style, but each somewhat more complex than that description would suggest. But basically we have something that could be recognised as Thatcherism. Well, given that, coming on to my second question, when did it emerge? When did Thatcherism come on to the scene? Well, Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in February 1975, and she was elected for one particular reason. She was not Edward Heath. Heath's style of leadership had created such resentment among Conservative members of Parliament, producing a parliamentary party that was ready, particularly after two successive election defeats in 1974, to change the leader. The party was uncertain as to where Heath proposed to lead it, and no longer convinced that he was the man to do so. Now, at the time, there was actually no formal means for removing the party leader. In 1965, the party had introduced a method of electing the leader by the parliamentary party. Before 1965, the leader of the Conservative Party was produced by a method known as emergence. That is, the leader just emerged following the previous leader going. This on occasion created problems, particularly when there was more than one person wanting to emerge as leader, since there was no formal means of choice. And on 2 occasions created embarrassment because the choice was then left to the Queen, who would rather not make such a political decision. So to avoid future embarrassment, in 1965, the party introduced a method of electing the leader by the parliamentary party. But the tenure was to be freehold rather than leasehold. In other words, once elected, that was it. The person was leader until such time as the leader decided otherwise. There was no method of annual election, of subjecting the leader to re-election. Well, in 1974, in the aftermath of defeat in the October general election, pressure within the parliamentary party built up for the leader to be subject to regular election. And believing himself to be invulnerable to defeat, Heath agreed to the new electoral rules, believing that he would be re-elected, but that process would get rid of some tension within the parliamentary party. So new rules were introduced, stipulating the annual election of the leader of the party by the parliamentary party. And that is the condition now in place. Formally, the leader of the party is elected each year in the autumn. So at the beginning of 1975, an election was called. Heath was obviously a candidate. And initially his principal opponent was Sir Keith Joseph, a leading member of the Shattuck Cabinet. But after a rather politically inept public speech, one in which basically suggested that working class women should not have children, and this was considered politically just a little unwise to make in a public arena, not considered a big vote getter, and created general worries about what he might do were he to become Prime Minister at some stage. He saw the writing on the wall that he'd sort of killed his own chances and withdrew from the race. And his place was taken by a very little known frontbencher called Margaret Thatcher. Hardly anybody knew who she was, but she stepped in to fill the gap on the grounds that somebody had to challenge Heath, rather than giving just a clear run at re-election. So she stepped in as the challenger to make a fight of it. And in the first ballot on the 4th of February, Margaret Thatcher received 130 votes. Edward Heath, whom everybody more or less expected to win, received 119 votes. So Mrs. Thatcher had an 11-vote victory on that first ballot. Edward Heath was mortified, as indeed he still is, and still refuses to accept he lost, and still refers to his successor as that woman. And I think the only contact with her since has been on one occasion where he spoke in monosyllables. Well, in fact, one monosyllable, when she asked him if he'd like a job under her, and his reply was no. And that was it. Heath was mortified and withdrew from the contest. His leadership was dead. Then in a second ballot, which was required under the party's rules, in which fresh challengers could actually come forward, Mrs. Thatcher achieved an absolute majority of votes and became leader of the Conservative Party, the party's first female leader. But Mrs. Thatcher's election as party leader should not be equated with either the election or the immediate emergence of Thatcherism. Mrs. Thatcher was clearly influenced by and increasingly associated with the neoliberal strand within the party. That was clear at the time of her election, and she offered clearly a new direction in which to lead the party. But the reason for her support among Conservative members of Parliament was because she offered a new direction, rather than because of the direction itself. On economic policy, the majority of Conservative MPs were and remain agnostic. There was not, nor has there been, a widespread conversion among the parliamentary party to the cause of neoliberalism. Indeed, Thatcherism, with its clear emphasis on the free economy and then the strong state, was not to emerge clearly until the party was returned to office in 1979. Until that time, Mrs. Thatcher was still working towards a personal philosophy, and in any event was constrained by political circumstance, both within and outside the party. There was a Labour government to be taken on and challenged on many issues other than the economic, particularly constitutional issues such as devolution. Within the party itself, Mrs. Thatcher's own supporters were lacking in government experience, or those with previous ministerial experience had supported Heath. So for her front bench team, she largely had to surround herself with those who were associated with Heath's premiership. So to some extent, she was constrained in her choice of front benchers. And that clearly affected the party's emphasis during this period. Indeed, the first major policy document of her leadership, called The Right Approach, published in 1976, was a very broad document, extolling the virtues of previous Conservative governments and reminding readers that an economic system predominantly based on private enterprise does not make us a laissez-faire party. A second document, The Right Approach to the Economy, published the following year, contained a clearer signal of the preference for monetarism, but also called for a new spirit of cautious realism, and included reference to government having to come to some conclusions about the scope for pay increases if large-scale unemployment was to be avoided. Not until she was ensconced in office was Mrs. Thatcher able to unleash a battery of policies that marked out her approach as distinctive, and one that could be recognised as being essentially neoliberal in orientation, particularly in those first few years of government. So Mrs. Thatcher's leadership actually predates Thatcherism by several years. I'll come back presently to whether Thatcherism is likely to outlast Mrs. Thatcher. But Mrs. Thatcher as party leader predates the emergence of Thatcherism. And recounting the circumstances of Mrs. Thatcher's election also helps qualify the assumption made by some that Thatcherism was an inevitable response to structural decline in the British economy. Mrs. Thatcher's approach was clear to embrace policies designed to deal with basic problems in the British economy. So Thatcherism in that sense may be seen as a response to structural decline. But there is a danger in imparting some degree of historical determinism to that correlation. Economic pressures of the time certainly induced significant and novel policy responses, but the nature of the response would likely have been very different had Edward Heath remained as leader of the Conservative Party, as he very nearly did. Had 6 Conservative MPs voted differently, he would still have been leader. And what made the difference between his re-election and defeat was not his economic policy, but his Olympian style of leadership. He was turned out because of the way he led the party, not necessarily because of the substance of the policy that he was pursuing. And in challenging him, Mrs. Thatcher took a chance. The outcome was by no means predictable, and indeed hardly anybody expected her to be elected as party leader. And she only achieved it very narrowly. So the outcome was by no means certain. But nonetheless, by 1979, we had a Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. We had something that we could now recognisably describe as Thatcherism. My third question is, what success has it had, given this 10 years of Thatcherism and Mrs. Thatcher in government? Well, Thatcherism has clearly had a major impact on British politics. Since 1979, Mrs. Thatcher has helped change the agenda of political debate. She leads. The rest of the political pack, supporters and opponents alike, are dragged along in her wake, some applauding, some complaining, but very few managing to keep up with her. So over the past 10 years, the face of British politics has clearly changed, and many of the policies pursued by Mrs. Thatcher will clearly continue for some time. But in hard policy terms, what has actually been achieved? Well, the record is essentially mixed. On the plus side, one of the most significant changes has come about in an area not anticipated when the party was in opposition. And that has been in the area of privatisation, which has produced the most extensive and tangible success for the government. A policy hit upon almost by accident. A range of public utilities and companies, so far 17 in all, including gas, telephones, British Airways, have been returned to private ownership. And the privatisation of several other public utilities is planned or underway. At the moment, the water industry is being privatised. There have been signals that in the next Parliament, the coal industry will be in line for privatisation. So privatisation has been extensive. And another success for the party has been the extension of private ownership. Not only in terms of property ownership, principally through the policy of allowing the sale of local authority housing, but also in terms of share ownership, a development itself encouraged by privatisation. Since 1979, more than 1 million public sector tenants have bought their own homes, thus putting beyond doubt that Britain is a home-owning society, something like 2/3 of adults now owning their own homes. And over 20% of the adult population, 3 times the proportion in 1979, now own shares quoted on the stock exchange. Inflation relative to the rate in the latter half of the 1970s, when at one stage it was over 25%, has been reduced and reached a low at the beginning of 1988 when it fell just below 4%. Taxes have been reformed, and the basic rate of income tax reduced from 33% in 79 to 25% since last year. And indeed now just 2 essential rates of income tax brought in to replace several rates before, 2 basic rates of 25% and 40%, replacing the several rates that existed before 79, the highest of which was at 83%. Public spending as a proportion of the gross domestic product is now at its lowest level for about 17 years. At the same time, the strong state has been realised through a variety of measures, most notably the abolition of certain councils, certain local councils, particularly the Greater London Council and the Metropolitan Councils, and by statutory constraints on others, and also through the reform of the trade unions, limiting the legal protection that previously they enjoyed. And over and above that, a wide range of significant, often radical measures have been introduced. In the first session of this Parliament alone, for example, major measures were passed reforming Britain's education system, reforming housing, and reforming local government finance. At the same time, the government can point to a high level of economic stability than when it entered office, and much higher levels of business confidence. Party publications regularly list the successes of the government, and the latest such publications run to about 40 to 50 pages. However, there's also a negative side. Clearly, a pure market economy has not been realised. For the reasons I've touched upon, there was little chance that it could be. Public spending continues to rise. The government has managed to slow the increase rather than achieve a real reduction. Meaningful money growth targets have been abandoned, and fiscal fine-tuning, applying the accelerator and then the brake, is back in fashion, with interest rates in Britain reaching new highs. There is also now a very significant deficit on balance of payments on current account, and inflation started to rise from the beginning of last year, reaching a peak last month of just over 8%, and now appears to some extent to have levelled off. But relative to other Western economies, the rate remains one of the highest. And throughout the period of Thatcher government, the rate of unemployment has remained at historically high levels. In the years between 1960 and 79, the percentage of the economically active population that was unemployed remained well below 10%. It peaked in the 70s in 1977 at 6.5%. Well, since 1979, the percentage rose, reaching a peak in 1986 of around 12%. Though it has declined since, consistently declined since, it remains high both in historical terms and when compared with unemployment in other Western economies. And the years since 1979 have witnessed some degree of social tension, with a so-called north-south divide opening up, and with tension, quite often racial tension, in certain inner-city areas, sparking riots in 1980, 1981 and 1985. And critics also tend to point to the fact that what success the government has achieved may be attributed in part to a favourable global economic climate since 1982, following the economic recession that marked the years before and for most of Mrs. Thatcher's first term of office. Well, that provides, if you like, something of a balance between the pluses and the minuses. The list is by no means exhaustive. It is sufficient for demonstrating the mixed record. And how you view that record depends on where you stand. Relative to the record of many past governments, It is more radical, more substantial, and on many indicators, more successful in terms of achieving the government's declared goals. Relative to the goals dictated by a free market, that is a neoliberal approach, it clearly falls short of expectations. Relative to the government's own rhetoric and to public expectations, the record is clearly one of partial success. So a record of partial success, particularly relative to what preceded it. But is Thatcherism then bigger than Mrs. Thatcher? Thatcher government has clearly had a major impact upon British politics, both in substance, as I've just outlined, and in the agenda, determining the agenda of political debate. But what about its long-term significance? Clearly many of the policies that have been introduced, such as privatisation, the effects of that will outlive Mrs. Thatcher. But what about Thatcherism as a set of beliefs actually continuing beyond her tenure of Downing Street? Is it possible that she's been able to mould public debate attitudes to ensure that those beliefs, as Thatcherism, actually outlive her tenure of Downing Street? And the short answer is no. Mrs. Thatcher, in short, is bigger than Thatcherism. The continuation of any element of Thatcherism beyond Mrs. Thatcher is contingent, not certain. Basically, it all depends upon the circumstances in which Mrs. Thatcher ceases to be leader of the Conservative Party. Despite the impact which Mrs. Thatcher has had upon British politics, she has not wrought a significant change in attitudes. She is Prime Minister and continues to be Prime Minister despite Thatcherism, not because of it. The trends in public opinion, analysed by Ivor Crewe and Donald Searing, published last year in the American Political Science Review, reveal that on only one of 10 issues did the attitudes of the electorate become more Thatcherite in the period between 1974 and 1987. On the remaining 9 issues, the electorate became less Thatcherite, in some cases markedly so. I'll quote briefly, if I may, from Crewe and Searing. Asked to choose between tax and social service cuts or tax and social service increases, the public was evenly divided, 37% apiece, when the Conservatives came to office in May 1979. By 1983, service increases outnumbered tax cutters by 52% to 24%, and by May 1987, by the even greater margin of 64% to 13%. Mrs. Thatcher may have triumphed in 1987, but Samuel Smiles did not. Now, those findings are also reinforced by British Social Attitude Survey published last year, which revealed that given a choice between holding down inflation, which is the government's priority, and holding down unemployment, only 23% of respondents favoured holding down inflation, 73% favoured holding down unemployment. And it is possible to argue that in many respects Mrs. Thatcher is the victim of her own success. By reducing the level of inflation, popular concern has shifted to the problems of unemployment and of maintaining the welfare state. Nor has Mrs. Thatcher effected a major and lasting shift in attitudes within the Conservative Party. Party supporters in the country, those party activists, give their support to Mrs. Thatcher because she is leader and also because of her manner of leadership. The style is popular. Within the Conservative Party, party loyalty traditionally flows to the leader, as indeed it did to Edward Heath in 1975. Constituency activists, who have no say in the election of leader, were strongly behind Heath. Only once Mrs. Thatcher won that first ballot did opinion within the party, that was outside Parliament, switch decisively behind her. And within the parliamentary party, only a minority of Conservative MPs may be categorised as neoliberals. I did a recent survey of every Conservative member of Parliament to try and identify particular groupings within the parliamentary party, and less than 20% of the parliamentary party can be described as Thatcherites. Almost equal by the number that can be described as wets and damps. But the largest single number, well over 50% of the party, falling within a category that can be described as the party faithful. Their loyalty is to the party, and ideology, and whoever is leader basically comes second. They are loyal to the leader as long as the leader looks likely to produce success. And success in Conservative terms means electoral success. So a majority of the Parliamentary Party are essentially agnostic on economic policy. And even within the Cabinet itself, neoliberals are in a minority, indeed more so in this Parliament than in the last Parliament. So the Conservative Party generally in the Parliamentary Party has not been created into a Thatcherite body. It has not, to use a popular term in Britain, in respect to Mrs Thatcher, been handbagged. When Mrs Thatcher retires, it will be the Parliamentary Party that will elect her successor, and who her successor will be, a Thatcherite or non-Thatcherite, will depend then in large measure upon the nature of her departure. If she goes at a time of her own choosing, when the party's in government and riding high in the opinion polls, she'll be in a position, a relatively strong position, to at least influence, not necessarily determine, but at least influence the choice of her successor. If she goes in the wake of an election defeat or at a time when the party has plummeted in the opinion polls, then her hold on the loyalty of Conservative MPs will be low, increasing the likelihood of a non-Thatcherite being elected. And whoever is elected to succeed her will determine the direction in which the Conservative Party then marches. There is no